Title: The Mechanics of Judgment, from Kant to Carnap and the Dream of Non-Forkability. Part 1: The Architecture of the Judgment. When we utter the empirical judgment, say the water is boiling, we seem to describe a fact. But the real work of the judgment lies elsewhere. It does not merely report what is seen. It resolves the question of what shall count as seen. The judgment establishes the mechanism of distinction through which yes becomes separable from no. A differentiation without which experience itself could never claim objectivity. Kant's insight was that this distinction cannot arise from sensation alone. The line between affirmation and negation must be structured, not simply felt. Otherwise, the declaration "the water is boiling" could never be distanced from its opposite. For that distance, the very possibility of telling that this state of affairs is different from that one must be grounded in the mechanics of discrimination. In Kant's terms, this is the labor of the manifold, the raw multiplicity of intuition ordered into unity by the form of judgment. Without that structuring power, the manifold remains a flux without articulation, and the transition from no to yes becomes only a tremor within it, a fluctuation of impressions that cannot decide itself. We could register variation but never verification. Judgment would dissolve into a passive sequence of correlations with no internal criterion for correctness, no way of knowing why one consequence follows and another does not. Part 2: The Empiricist's Dream of Reduction. Now, one of empiricism's most persistent solutions, and perhaps its most indispensable dogma, for without it, empiricism drifts too far from its anti-metaphysical stance, is reductionism. Reductionism is the conviction that every meaningful statement about the world can, in principle, be translated into statements about immediate experience. This premise sustains the belief that certain empirical judgments, however entangled in the complexity of data, can still be projected along unified trajectories. They do not fork. Their empirical territory is cumulative, not antagonistic. As Quine wrote in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, you see, the dogma is not simply the belief that knowledge must rest on some ultimate foundation. It is also the deeper conviction that such a foundation must also stabilize opposition. To know, then, is not merely to sense a change, but to inhabit a form of organization that grants difference a grammar, a system in which negation has a place, a cost, and a rule. This is what reductionism secretly promises, that beneath all variations of experience, there lies a floor of invariance, a structure capable of keeping yes and no apart, so that verification becomes a matter of form rather than interpretation. That formal spacing between affirmation and denial is what allows knowledge to possess an engine of its own. Part 3: language as the everyday laboratory. Speaking in such terms may sound like an elaborate metaphysical indulgence, a string of fine distinctions spun by philosophers with nothing better to do. Unless, of course, we show how easily things go astray in ordinary speech. The issue, in fact, is never far from daily life. Judgments are structurally articulated through the language available to us. When we say water, that word already summons a field of associations: temperature, purity, transparency, thirst, while at the same time suppressing countless other possibilities. The act of classifying selects and selection is part of a judgment. But here lies the trouble. Our language does not articulate these links cleanly enough to tell rule from accident, essence from habit. Take, for instance, bachelor and unmarried men. They are treated as identical, neat little mirrors of each other. Yet the negation of one is not mechanically convertible into the affirmation of the other's anti-extension. Language, with its cheerful imprecision, refuses to operate like a machine. Well, we can of course be trained to treat not a bachelor as coextensive with what we call married, and we can even build models that mimic this recognition, but not an innocent machine that understands it. Even if no conceivable situation distinguishes the two expressions, their contributive power, their semantic charge within the network of use, remains different. As Quine observed again, and so the question returns, sharper than before: how can we be sure that our criteria of objectivity are not merely the residues of our own training? It is as if judgment begin to wobble like a compass near a magnet. The yes and the no that once guaranteed knowledge start to blur, and the difference between understanding and imitation slips quietly through the cracks of our most formal systems. Part 4: Non-Forkability and the Mechanization of Antagonism. In The Logical Syntax of Language, 1934, Carnap's central ambition was to show that the unity and reliability of science could be guaranteed at the level of linguistic form. The idea was that of a non-forkable system, a formal language in which two syntactically correct derivations from the same empirical basis could never lead to incompatible results. Non-forkability was meant to ensure that any valid transformation within the system would preserve the total set of empirical consequences. Under this condition, the coherence of science would be a product of syntax alone. Carnap's idea was that if the rules of transformation were sufficiently well defined, the relation between a statement and the negation of its anti-extension could itself be mechanically quantified. A non-forkable language would be one in which logical structure already encoded the antagonism between a predicate and its complement, so that every reformulation, paraphrase, or substitution would reproduce the same empirical statements. In such a calculus, the difference between P and not P would not threaten the unity of science, because their inferential trajectories would be harmonized by the formal system itself. The machine of syntax would guarantee that no empirical law could split into rival formulations. This was not a minor technical detail for Carnap. Non-forkability was the logical precondition for inductive neutrality, the dream of a projection that would be clean, objective, and independent of the idiosyncrasies of natural language. If every transformation preserved equivalence, the inductive extension of a law would depend solely on its formal structure, not on semantic ambiguity. Scientific laws would thus be mechanically projectable. Every valid inference would trace a single, unbranching path from data to theory, ensuring that confirmation was a matter of computation and not interpretation. Part 5. The breaking point. This mechanization of antagonism required more than syntax could deliver. Predicates like married and bachelor do not oppose each other along a single logical axis. The negation of one is not the affirmation of the other. Their anti-extensions are orthogonal, not complementary. In order to encode the antagonism between predicates that do not align neatly as logical opposites, Carnap discovered that he could no longer rely solely on the machinery of syntax. This was his reluctant passage into semantics. What began as a quest for a purely formal foundation for science now revealed the need for an explicit theory of meaning. By the time of Meaning and Necessity, 1947, Carnap's logical machine had become semi-semantic, its supposed neutrality sustained only by the very concept of sense it had once hoped to eliminate. But that is precisely the point. This move represents a silent revision of his earlier program, for it introduces a layer of meaning that the syntactic framework was designed to avoid. Once this intentional component enters, the project of non-forkability ceases to be innocent and neutral. To find the fixed point, to borrow Kripke's term, 1975, where affirmation is antagonistic to its anti-extension, is not something that can be simply presupposed. It must be theorized at a deeper, non-empirical level. This is, in effect, the comeback of metaphysics, though we will return to that question later. For now, let us see how we arrived at this breaking point. Six, the collapse of formal harmony. To ensure that laws remain projectable, Carnap must build into the calculus precisely the semantic awareness he had hoped to exclude in his early program. The machine of syntax becomes a semi-semantic organism, one that simulates the stability of meaning without truly possessing it. The antagonism between extension and anti-extension, once meant to be neutralized, returns as a hidden premise of the very rules that were supposed to eliminate it. It is at this juncture that the critiques of Hempel, Goodman, and Quine becomes decisive. Hempel reveals that even at the level of inductive confirmation, the formal harmony between a statement and the negation of its anti-extension breaks down. The hypothesis all crows are black is logically equivalent to all non-black things are non-crows. Yet, the anti-extension of the first, green apples, white paper, blue shirts, does not empirically support it. The situation is this. Of course, the absence of non-black crows would confirm the law, but does the abundance of non-black non-crows also confirms it? The supposed symmetry between a predicate and its anti-extension, which the principle of non-forkability presupposed, collapses under the asymmetry of confirmation. Orthogonality arises precisely where logic had promised equivalence. Nelson Goodman radicalizes this discovery. At the level of predicate choice, he shows that achieving non-forkability and mechanical projectability requires not a cleaner empirical base, but a reorganization of language itself. The decision over which predicates are projectable, green or grue, black or black until 2050, depends on entrenched habits of discrimination that no formal syntax can predetermine. The act of carving up the world is already pragmatic and historical, not merely syntactic. Finally, there is Quine. For Quine, this entire edifice rests on circular ground. The very attempt to define a difference between two opposing syntactic statements within a single mechanizable training set reveals the futility of the project. No synonym, no formal equivalent can be shown to be a priori antagonistic to another, for that antagonism is already revisable. Each language constructs its own patterns of divergence, its own map of conflict and coherence. The formal system, therefore, cannot mechanize antagonism because the antagonism is not structural but illusory, a mirage produced by the hope of neutrality itself. It survives only as an intentional patch, added ad hoc to preserve the appearance of a stable projection where none truly exists. The formal system, therefore, cannot mechanize antagonism because that antagonism is not structural but illusory, a mirage produced by the hope of neutrality itself. It survives only as a meaning patch, added ad hoc to preserve the appearance of a stable projection where none truly exists. The ideal of non-forkability, once the proud emblem of logical empiricism, exposes instead the persistence of meaning beneath syntax, the unformalizable residue that binds every law to the contingent grammar of its language. In an analytic universe, there are no unbranching languages, no clean projections. Every inference forks, not because logic fails, but because meaning itself exceeds its structure, saturating the very possibility of empirical order. The dream of a neutral syntax thus returns as its opposite, a demonstration that no language, however formal, can escape the metaphysics it presupposes.